It was just an ordinary Tuesday when Carmen Ruiz, a shy receptionist at a luxury hotel in Madrid, made what she thought was an unforgivable mistake. She noticed an elegant older woman with silver hair who looked confused in the lobby, so she approached her and asked in sign language if she needed help. The woman's face lit up, and she gratefully replied that she was looking for her son. What Carmen didn't know was that Alejandro Vega, the millionaire owner of Media Madrid, was watching the scene from the elevator. For years, he'd been searching for someone who would treat his mother Pillar, not as a disability to hide, but as a person worthy of respect. When he saw this young receptionist communicating so naturally with his deaf mother, the heart of this cold and powerful man melted for the first time in decades, because sometimes it only takes a few hand gestures to open not just a conversation, but a heart that thought it had forgotten how to love. Carmen Ruiz was 24 years old and had been working as a receptionist at the Grand Villarreal Hotel for 3 months. Every morning at 7:30, she took the subway from Vallecas to Seoul. Then she'd walk 10 minutes through the historic downtown streets to the luxurious hotel where she still felt out of place. She came from humble beginnings, raised on the outskirts of Madrid by a single mother who cleaned offices to keep her in school. Carmen had studied languages at Complutense University, but her true passion was Spanish Sign Language, which she'd learned to communicate with her younger brother Pablo, who was born deaf. What many saw as a disability had become second nature to her, a form of communication made of dancing hands and speaking eyes. The Grand Hotel was a world apart from hers. International guests, executives in suits worth thousands of dollars, women with designer handbags and jewelry that cost more than her annual salary. Carmen felt like a fish out of water in her navy blue uniform and timid smile, but she did her best to be professional and discreet. That October Tuesday, Madrid was wrapped in an unusual fog that made everything feel more mysterious. Carmen was behind the reception desk reviewing the day's reservations when she spotted an elegant woman in her 60s entering the lobby with an uncertain step. She wore a perfectly tailored pearl gray suit, her silver hair styled with class. But there was confusion in her eyes that Carmen recognized right away. The woman looked around, lost, trying to get her bearings in the luxurious but intimidating space. She approached the desk and started gesturing nervously with her hands, trying to make herself understood. Carmen's colleagues watched awkwardly, unsure how to communicate with her. Without thinking twice, Carmen stepped out from behind the desk and approached the woman, woman. With fluid, natural movements, she started signing in Spanish Sign Language, asking if she needed help. The woman's face lit up instantly, her eyes filling with gratitude. Her name was Pilar Vega, and she was looking for her son Alejandro, who was supposed to meet her there for lunch. She was 70 years old and had been deaf since birth, but she'd lived a full and independent life until age made her more fragile and unsure when traveling. Carmen escorted her to the lobby lounge, offered her a coffee, and stayed to chat. Pilar told her that her son was always so busy with work. He ran multiple companies and hotels, but he always tried to take care of her despite his commitments. What neither Carmen nor Pilar knew was that from the panoramic elevator descending slowly, Alejandro Vega was watching the entire scene. At 41, he was one of Spain's most powerful businessmen, owner of a luxury hotel chain, Michelin-starred restaurants, and real estate investments worth hundreds of millions. He was used to seeing his mother treated with forced respect by his employees, who often didn't know how to act around her. But that morning he saw something different. A young receptionist communicating with his mother not out of professional duty, but with genuine warmth and humanity. He saw Pilar smiling in a way he hadn't seen in years, relaxed and comfortable, like she was talking to an old friend. Alejandro stayed in the elevator even after it stopped, continuing to watch the scene that was moving him more than he wanted to admit. For years, he'd been looking for someone who saw his mother not as a responsibility or a problem to manage, but as the extraordinary woman she'd always been. When he finally stepped out and approached, he saw Carmen showing his mother photos on her phone. probably of the deaf brother she'd mentioned. Pillar was laughing with pure joy that he hadn't seen in far too long. Carmen's life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined, all because of a kind gesture that had felt like the most natural thing in the world to her. When Alejandro Vega approached the lounge where his mother was chatting animatedly with Carmen, his presence immediately filled the space. He was tall, 6'2", with dark hair swept back and gray eyes that seemed to assess everything with mathematical precision. Alejandro had that aura of power typical of men used to being in charge. Carmen recognized him right away. She'd seen his photo in business newspapers and knew he owned the hotel chain where she worked, but she'd never expected to meet him in person. Her heart started pounding, fearing she'd done something wrong by approaching a guest without permission. Pillar looked up and saw her son. Her face lit up, and she started signing quickly, telling him about this kind young woman who spoke her language and had kept her company. Alejandro mentally translated his mother's gestures, but his eyes were fixed on Carmen, who had stood up, clearly flustered. For the first time in years, Alejandro saw his mother talk about someone with pure enthusiasm. Pillar told him that Carmen had a deaf brother, that she'd studied languages, that she'd shown her family photos. It was like she'd found an unexpected treasure in that luxurious lobby. Carmen started apologizing, explaining that she'd only wanted to help and hoped she hadn't crossed any professional boundaries. But Alejandro stopped her with a raised hand. Then he did something that surprised all three of them. He started signing, though his movements were less fluid and more hesitant than Carmen's. His mother was stunned. Alejandro had learned sign language as a child, but he hadn't used it in years, relying on professional interpreters for important communications with her. Seeing her son speak her language again, even awkwardly, filled Pillar with a joy she hadn't felt in decades. Alejandro thanked Carmen for her kindness toward his mother, but there was something in his eyes that went beyond simple professional gratitude. In this shy receptionist, he'd seen something he never found in his world of luxury and power: genuine humanity with no ulterior motives. In the days that followed, Alejandro started stopping by the hotel reception more often, officially to check on operations, but really to watch Carmen at work. He saw her interact with international guests, switching languages effortlessly, smiling shyly, but always with sincere courtesy. One Thursday evening, as Carmen was finishing her shift, Alejandro approached the desk. He asked to speak with her privately in his upstairs office. Carmen felt her blood run cold, convinced she was about to be fired for talking to his mother without permission. In Alejandro's office was imposing: dark wood-paneled walls, an antique desk that cost more than Carmen's car, valuable artwork, and a stunning view of Madrid at night. Carmen sat on the edge of the chair, her hands trembling slightly. But instead of reprimanding her, Alejandro made her an offer that left her speechless. He wanted to hire her as his personal assistant to handle all interactions with his mother, double her salary, flexible hours, and the chance to work directly with him on the company's most important projects. Carmen stared at him in disbelief. She couldn't understand why a man so powerful and wealthy would take an interest in a simple receptionist from the suburbs. When she asked him directly, Alejandro explained something she hadn't expected. Since his father died 10 years earlier, he'd built a business empire but lost real human connection with the people he loved. His mother had become a responsibility he managed through employees and professionals, not someone he shared true intimate moments with. Seeing Carmen communicate so naturally with her had made him realize how much he'd sacrificed the human side of his life for professional success. Carmen accepted the offer, but she asked for something in return. She wanted Alejandro to seriously relearn sign language so he could communicate directly with his mother without intermediaries. It was the start of a journey that would transform not just Carmen's professional life, but the icy heart of a millionaire who'd forgotten what it meant to truly love. Working as Alejandro's assistant meant entering a universe Carmen had never imagined. Pillar's apartment was a 4,300 square foot penthouse furnished in luxury, but it felt more like a museum than a home. Pillar moved through those vast spaces with a loneliness that broke Carmen's heart. Carmen discovered that despite all the comfort, Pillar was deeply alone. Alejandro provided every material need: but they hadn't shared true family intimacy in years. Pilar told her how Alejandro had been different as a child, curious, affectionate. After his father's death, he turned into a man of steel. Meanwhile, Carmen taught Alejandro sign language during late night sessions. Alejandro, used to controlling everything, found himself vulnerable as she patiently corrected his gestures. During one lesson, he confessed he'd been living in constant tension since taking over the company and could no longer express his love to his mother properly. They started organizing weekly family dinners. Pilar shared stories from Alejandro's childhood, and he discovered sides of his mother he hadn't known, her passion for art, her youthful dreams. For Carmen, witnessing this reconciliation was thrilling but painful. She was falling in love with Alejandro, but she knew they came from different worlds and different worlds. One night, after a particularly warm dinner, Alejandro stopped her and took her hand. Pilar, noticing the tension between them, started signing that. In her opinion, her son was in love and she'd never seen him so at peace. That moment was the truth that changed everything. The following weeks were a whirlwind of conflicting emotions for Carmen. Pilar had exposed what all three of them felt, but no one dared say. The affection between Alejandro and Carmen had grown naturally through the sign language lessons and family dinners, but both were terrified of what those feelings meant. Alejandro started acting differently, no longer the cold executive giving orders, but a man who found any excuse to spend time with her. He'd bring her coffee during breaks, genuinely ask about her family, and seek her advice not just on his mother, but on major business decisions. 1. Carmen felt torn between the joy of being valued by such an extraordinary man and the fear of not measuring up to his world. The tabloids often mentioned his past relationships with heiresses, famous actresses, and international jet-set women. How could she, with her modest background and shyness, compete with that? The turning point came during a charity gala at Madrid's most luxurious hotel. Alejandro was attending as a major donor and asked Carmen to accompany him as his official assistant. Pilar insisted on coming too, saying she wanted to see her son in his professional element. Carmen felt completely out of place in that gilded world. She'd bought an elegant but affordable dress and felt inadequate next to women dripping in jewels and designer gowns. Alejandro, however, never left her or his mother's side, proudly introducing them to colleagues and friends. During the evening, something happened that changed how Carmen saw herself and her worth. One guest, an arrogant, condescending woman, started making derogatory remarks about disabled people, saying they ruined the atmosphere at elegant events. Pilar, who read lips perfectly, understood everything and was deeply hurt. Carmen didn't hesitate. With a firmness she didn't know she had, she stood up and told the woman exactly what she thought of her ignorance and rudeness. She explained that Pilar was one of the most intelligent and cultured people she'd ever met, and her disability didn't make her any less worthy of respect. The scene drew attention from many guests, and Carmen realized she'd raised her voice in an environment where control was everything. She expected Alejandro to be embarrassed, but when she looked at him, she saw pure pride in his eyes. Alejandro stood, took Carmen's hand, and told everyone present that he was proud to have beside him a woman who knew the difference between pocket wealth and heart wealth. Then, in front of everyone, he kissed Carmen passionately, publicly declaring his feelings. Puller, who'd followed the whole scene, started applauding silently with raised hands, and many other guests joined in. For the first time, Carmen felt part of that world, not because she pretended to be someone else, but because she'd had the courage to be herself. That night, in the car ride home, Alejandro took Carmen's hand and said something she'd never forget. He told her he'd spent his life surrounded by people who always said yes, who never challenged him, who admired him only for his money. She was the first person who loved him for the man he was, not for what he owned. Puller from the back seat signed that in her opinion, they'd wasted enough time and it was about time they got married. Both burst out laughing, but in their hearts they knew the old lady was right. Love had conquered fear, authenticity had beaten calculation, and courage had triumphed over social convention. 6 months after that magical gala night, Carmen's life had changed in ways she'd never dared dream. Not just materially. Though Alejandro had now gifted her a beautiful apartment near Pillars, but emotionally above all. Alejandro had become a completely different man. Carmen's love had made him more human, more attentive to others' feelings, more present in his mother's life. He'd started delegating more at work to spend time with family, discovering that personal happiness made him more effective professionally. Pilar had been reborn. Having Carmen as a daughter in law gave her not just a daughter, but a bridge to a world she'd always felt distant from. Carmen took her to meet her original family, and Pilar grew incredibly fond of Pablo, Carmen's deaf brother, whom she saw as the grandson she'd never had. The marriage proposal came in a surprising way. Alejandro didn't stage a grand romantic scene in a starred restaurant or on a panoramic terrace. Instead, one Sunday morning while the three of them were having breakfast in Pilar's apartment, he got down on one knee with a ring that had belonged to his grandmother. Pilar started crying with joy, signing that she'd always dreamed of this moment. Carmen said yes through tears, knowing she wasn't just marrying the man she loved, but joining a family that had welcomed her with open hearts. Wedding preparations revealed Alejandro's transformation even more. Instead of a lavish event with hundreds of guests, he chose an intimate ceremony in the private chapel of the royal palace, with only the people they truly loved: Carmen's family, a few trusted colleagues, and of course, Pilar as maid of honor. On the wedding day, Pilar surprised everyone. She'd prepared a speech in sign language, which Alejandro translated aloud for the guests. She told how Carmen had brought her son back to emotional life, how she'd turned their museum-like home into a real family home, and how she'd shown that true love knows no barriers of language, social class, or disability. But the biggest surprise came at the reception. Pablo, Carmen's brother, stood and gave a full speech in sign language. Alejandro, now fluent, translated simultaneously for everyone. Pablo shared how his sister had always believed diversity was a gift, not a limitation, and how their family had gained not just a brother-in-law, but a brother. The honeymoon was different from what you'd expect from a millionaire. Instead of some exclusive resort across the world, Alejandro and Carmen chose to travel Spain with Pilar, visiting art and cultural sites the mother-in-law had never seen with someone who shared her passion. In Seville, Pilar was enchanted by the cathedral in Giralda. Carmen described everything in detail, and Alejandro realized his mother had an artistic sensitivity he'd never fully appreciated. In Barcelona, they sailed the harbor while Pilar shared romantic stories she'd read in books, proving that love for beauty doesn't need ears to exist. When they returned, Carmen and Alejandro settled into a new home they bought together, a villa with a garden in Pozuelo, big enough for Pilar to stay whenever she wanted, but intimate enough for a real family home. Carmen continued working in Alejandro's company, but now as HR director, bringing her people-focused sensitivity to an environment that had always needed it. She introduced inclusivity programs, sign language courses for employees, and policies that considered human needs alongside economic ones. In the evenings, when they got home, the three of them would sit in the garden watching the sunset over Madrid. Pilar told stories, Alejandro talked about future plans, and Carmen realized she'd found far more than a rich husband. She'd found a family that loved her for who she was and whom she loved unconditionally. 2 years after the wedding, Alejandro and Carmen's home echoed with a new voice, that of little Pilar, named after her grandmother, who at 6 months old had already completely captured everyone's hearts. The baby was born hearing, but Carmen and Alejandro had already decided that even if she were deaf like her grandma, she'd be loved just the same. Pilar Sr., now 72, had found in her grandmother Rolla joy never known, Ekla. She spent hours playing with the baby, singing silent lullabies with her hands and showering her with kisses. Alejandro watched these scenes with emotion, seeing his mother finally serene and fulfilled. Alejandro's company had reached new heights, not just financially. It had become a model of inclusivity in the Spanish hotel industry. Many hotels now employed staff with disabilities, offered specialized services for deaf and blind guests, and trained all employees in inclusive communication. Soon. Carmen had discovered a natural talent for business, and Alejandro made her vice president. She brought the human touch his economic empire had always needed, transforming how they treated employees and guests. One night, as they all dined together with little Pillar laughing in her high chair at every gesture from Grandma, Alejandro made an important announcement. He decided to create a foundation for deaf inclusion, funded by part of his profits, and he wanted Carmen to lead it. The foundation would offer free sign language courses, support for families with deaf members, job placement programs, and above all, promote a culture where diversity was seen not as a hurdle to overcome, but as a richness to celebrate. Hiller cried with emotion when she heard about it. It seemed incredible that what had started as her disability had now become the starting point to help thousands of others. She told them she was proud of the son he'd become and the daughter-in-law who'd brought so much love to their family. The foundation's inauguration was held in the main ballroom of the Villarreal Hotel, where it all began. Carmen gave a speech that moved everyone present. She shared how a simple act of kindness toward a deaf woman had transformed not just her life, but an entire family's. She explained that true love doesn't need words to be communicated, that the greatest wealth isn't measured in money, but in authentic relationships, and that often the people we see as different teach us the deepest lessons about life. Alejandro, translating simultaneously into sign language for the deaf guests, paused for a moment to look at his wife with admiration. The shy girl he'd met 2 years earlier had become a confident woman capable of inspiring hundreds with her story and vision. Pillar sat in the front row holding little Pillar, and all the deaf attendees could see the pride in her eyes. She'd raised her son alone after her husband's death, fighting prejudice and misunderstanding. Now she saw that pain transformed into a force that would help others. At the end of the day, as they drove home to their villa, Carmen reflected on how strange life was. She'd started as a shy receptionist in a luxury hotel, convinced she wasn't good enough for that gilded world. Now she was vice president, a beloved wife, a happy mother, and director of a foundation that would change thousands of lives. But the most beautiful part was that she hadn't had to change herself to get any of it. She'd stayed the kind, authentic person she'd always been, and discovered that was exactly what the world needed. That night, as they tucked little Pillar in, Alejandro told Carmen something she'd treasure forever in her heart. He said she'd not only given him love, but taught him how to love. She'd not only given him a daughter, but given him back his mother. She not only brought him happiness, but shown him that happiness multiplies when shared with others. Looking at their sleeping daughter, Carmen knew she'd teach her that hands can speak, that the heart doesn't need ears to feel, and that the deepest love often arrives when you least expect it, through a simple, sincere gesture. Because sometimes it just takes knowing how to say hello with your hands to open a world of infinite possibilities. Sometimes a simple greeting can change 3 lives forever. Sometimes those who seem different teach us how to be more human. And sometimes the truest love is born when you stop pretending to be someone else. Because hands that know how to speak often say more than 1,000 words.